Hello everybody, we're going to start with Chapter 8 in Healthcare Supervision. We are talking about interviewing, start strong to recruit successfully. And again, as in previous chapters, we're going to hit the highlights here. This chapter starts on page 133 in your textbook, and we're going to talk about a couple of these key terms. We're going to talk about a BFOQ, which is a bona fide occupational qualification. This is an item of otherwise forbidden personal information that is essential to performance in a specific job position. And so we're going to talk about what that means a little later in the chapter and in the slides. And then we're going to talk about the box. The box is another key term. The box is reference to the checkoff space on a job application asking whether an applicant has or has not been convicted of a crime. And we're going to get into that just a little bit more. Okay, so flipping over, one thing we are going to talk about in Chapter 8 that we've kind of not hit on in Chapter 3 and 4 is the for consideration, which starts on page 133. Here are a list of 25 potential interview questions, and what you need to do with these 25 interview questions is read through and determine whether or not these questions are lawful or unlawful. There are certain areas that we're going to cover in this chapter that you just cannot ask an applicant for a job. You can't specifically ask someone, when's your birthday? What year were you born? Are you married? Do you have kids? All of those questions are kind of off limits. So we're going to review some of that. All right, so Chapter 8, we're going to start on 135 over under the section where it says the manager and the interview. The personal interview is often not a particularly reliable means of finding good employees. We have no guarantees that the process will always generate positive results. No matter how good we become at interviewing or how much we know about the jobs we're attempting to fill, it frequently remains impossible to separate true ability in a job candidate from the ability to simply talk a good job. However, in spite of its shortcomings and weaknesses, we must usually rely on the face-to-face employee selection interview for locating new employees simply because there's no other practical means available for approaching the task. All right, so we're going to flip over to 136 on that bottom paragraph on that left side of the page. An organization here and there may still follow the age-old and highly undesirable practice of having a very few people, perhaps only one or two, doing all of the actual employee selection for the entire organization. This outdated practice is contrary to the fundamentals of supervisory responsibility. We cannot simply give an already chosen employee to a supervisor and expect to facilitate the establishment of the proper employee-supervisor relationship. If the supervisor is to be responsible for an employee's performance, then the supervisor must be allowed a consistent amount of authority in selecting that employee. The supervisory role should include, subject to carefully drawn ground rules, the authority to hire and fire. All right, so recruiting. Candidates outside and inside, still on page 136. Job applicants often come to your organization in response to employment advertising specific to certain personnel needs. Many also come not in response to specific recruiting efforts, but unsolicited. They fill out an employment applications in hope of finding work. Both solicited and unsolicited applicants reach the attention of the interviewing supervisor following screening interviews in which Human Resources determines that the applicants are qualified to fill some specific need. Most organizations operate job posting systems and have policies governing employee transfers, so a number of candidates for any particular position may also come from within the present workforce. The more specified a need, the more likely the supervisor is to see a preponderance of external candidates. For example, benefits specialists, pharmacists, electricians, radiation therapy technologists. And the more generalized a need, the more likely the supervisor is to see a preponderance of internal candidates, secretary, building service worker, kitchen helper, transport aide, and so on. In more than a few cases, in filling a particular position, you will be able to choose from among a pool of candidates that includes both internal and external. Most organizations likewise espouse a philosophy of development from within by way of either lateral or promotional transfers. It should be stressed that this notion of development from within is most likely to be more philosophy than policy. No astute top manager will absolutely require the supervisor select an internal candidate in any particular situation. Moving over to 137, forcing the selection of an employee without extraordinarily good cause can put the supervisor in a position of having to take a candidate who is less desirable than the apparently best available. But even though the notion of development from within may not be an inviolable policy, you should nevertheless incorporate it into practice whenever reasonably possible. And so, like the slide says, your hiring should have a healthy mix of both outside of the facility and then promotion and transfer from within. All outside hiring is going to stifle promotion and growth for present employees because they're going to feel like they do not have any opportunities. They're never going to get to move up. And then if you only hire from within and only transfer and promote from within, then you can get a lead. You can lead to inbreeding of thought and attitude. Same old, status quo, nothing changes, so there's a stifling of creativity there. All right, so let's talk about preparing for the interview. We're still on page 137. So in preparing for an interview, the supervisor needs two things. They need the job description of the job that they're hiring for, and they need the individual's application or resume, or both in some instances. They have to review both of these thoroughly before they sit down with this candidate. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about this. So under the job description, in preparing to interview a job applicant, you first need to become fully conversant with the job description. There's nothing wrong with having the job description in front of you for an occasional reference during the interview, but you have to be prepared to speak with knowledge about this position without looking at that paper, because typically you're hiring for a job that you're supervising. You should know that job backwards and forwards. So one of the things, or a few of the things, and we're going to go through these slides and see some of the things that you should talk to the interviewer about, or things that they should know, is they should know the knowledge and skills required. They're applying for this position. They should know what this job is. Do they have the background and experience required? Do they have the formal education level required? Do they have the needed familiarity with equipment and processes? Do they know the job duties? Do they have any responsibility for supervisions of others? Do they have any responsibility for the safety of others? Is there potential loss due to error? There's confidentiality requirements to each position. There's contracts and relationships. There's physical demands of the job, whether you're going to be sitting for a long time or if there's walking or lifting. You have to put in job descriptions these days. If there is to be lifting, then it's going to be no more than 50 pounds. You need to know the visual, auditory, and other sensory requirements of the job, any potential stressors, closeness of supervision, the working conditions, which includes the hours, the compensations and benefits generally. And a lot of times this doesn't happen on a first interview, so I'll just tell you now, when you go out for a job, do not ask anyone during a first interview what the pay for the position is. Just don't do it. And what future potential that job has. So you have a lot of different bullet points there on page 137. And then let's talk about outdated information. Most employment applications more than a few years old ask for information that can no longer legally be requested. And if we flip over on 137, that bottom paragraph under that section, it says, chances are that if you have worked for your present employer for a few years, the application you originally completed might today be considered illegal or at least questionable in some way. If you have worked at the same place since 1980 or earlier, the application you originally submitted would today be decidedly illegal in a number of aspects. So this kind of changes, as time goes on, of what can be asked, what can't be asked. All right, so let's talk about what we cannot talk about or what we cannot ask during an interview. So moving over to page 139, guidelines for questioning. Although common courtesy should prevail in your interview behavior at all times, courtesy by itself is not enough. You must be constantly aware of questions or comments that could be taken as discriminatory in some way, although not intended as such. An applicant may volunteer information related to the following precautions, but you may not ask for this information. All right, so what are our questions to avoid? So anything direct or implied for age, birth date, race, religion, national origin. So under age and other considerations on 139. You cannot ask any question that requires the applicant to reveal their age, their date of birth, race, religion, or national origin. The direct questions, when were you born, should be easy to avoid. But you got to watch out for indirect questions where you're fishing for specific information. So let's say I'd say we've both been around about the same length of time, both early baby boomers perhaps. This could readily be construed as attempting to determine the approximate age of the applicant. All right, so turning over to 154. Cannot inquire about disabilities. Similar to concerns about age, there are few, if any, safe questions the supervisor can ask about disability, whether a candidate's disability is evident or not. The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, provides a national mandate barring bias against persons with disabilities. And requests for recommendations. You may not ask if the applicant has a recommendation from a past or present employer. This may be taken as discriminatory since it may be difficult for the applicant to secure such a recommendation because of reasons other than job performance. And those may be race, religion, political affiliation, so forth. Now, some of these get a little jumbled up here, so we're going to jump around a little bit. You cannot ask about relatives or family. So on page 140, that's going to cover two sections. That's going to cover your emergency contact, and that's going to cover family. So you can't ask for the identity of the person's nearest relative or their next of kin in an interview situation. And under family, you may not ask the marital status of the applicant at the time of the interview. Particular sensitivity has been developed along these lines in recent years. Many women have been able to claim, often with considerable success, that they were denied employment because of the marital or family status. So sometimes it's statistically substantiated that young women recently engaged often quit shortly after they get married. Young, recently married women may leave after a year or two to begin families. Or unmarried women with small children tend on the average to have poorer attendance records than other workers. So again, you cannot ask questions about family. All right, so back over to, or actually we're going to stay on 141, asking about home ownership or other assets. That falls under affluence. You may not ask if the applicant owns a home or a car. This may be interpreted as seeking to test affluence, which may in turn be taken as discriminatory against certain minorities. You may, however, ask if the applicant has a driver's license, but only if driving is a bona fide occupational qualification. There's that term we talked about at the beginning, a BFOQ. That is a requirement of the job. So if driving is part of the job, you can ask about a driver's license. If driving is not part of that job, you cannot ask if they have a driver's license. All right, so credit standing is our next section, and surprisingly enough, I'm not sure why height and weight are under there. But so you cannot request height or weight, again, unless there is a specific job-related requirement, a BFOQ. So one position that I think that could actually be an issue is a flight nurse or a flight medic. You know, there are weight limits in helicopters, and so that may be one position where height or weight could be, you know, important to an actual position. Okay, so at the top of credit standing, you may not ask if the applicant's wages were ever attached or garnished, or if the individual has outstanding loans or other financial obligations. So you can't do that. Then we're jumping back up to asking about arrest, and again we're talking about the box, and that was another key term we talked about earlier. So at the bottom of 144, it's talking about a yes or no required, followed by an explanation if yes, concerning arrest or convictions. Over the past year or so, the box has come under fire from several directions. The complaints about this particular solicitation of information are focused on the issue of convictions. The issue of revealing arrest was effectively put to rest some time ago. So usually convictions are what should be answered about, not just arrest. All right, and then dropping down on that next one, we talked about whether wages have been garnished. Let's talk about union activity or affiliation. You may not ask whether an applicant is or has been a member of a union or has been involved in organizing or other union activities. From a supervisor's perspective, this precaution becomes especially important if a union is attempting to organize your employees. And last but not least, you cannot ask if anyone is receiving Social Security. So you may not ask obviously older applicants if they're receiving Social Security benefits. It has been demonstrated concerning the older persons applying for part-time work that some employers have discriminated in favor of applicants receiving Social Security payments, since a person receiving a combined income may be more likely to remain on the job longer than one to whom the part-time job is the sole means of support. And so we talked about the box already under current issues. Is there's increasing pressure to eliminate that checkoff box asking whether you've ever been convicted of a crime. And then let's talk about salary history. Salary history is again on page 142. One of the most prominent present-day issues concerning recruitment and employment activity is salary history. It has long been a practice of many employers to ask job applicants how much they're paid at their present job or what they earned in prior employment. This practice is now regularly charged, serves to continue the disparity in salary that exists between women and men in the workplace. For essentially most job applicants, whether male or female, it has long been a practice to base salary offers on what the applicant was most recently earning rather than on the scale indicating the monetary worth of the position. So if you're going into a job that has a job salary range of $14 to $16, but you made $13.50 at your last job, well, they may only offer you $13.75 because they know you're going to be making more than you were making at your previous job, but they're not having to pay you the $14 that you may earn because of your experience or credentials or whatever. So, I would advise you, if you have part-time jobs, things like that, when you start applying for jobs, I would leave that section blank. I would not show that salary history for those reasons. All right, so what happens when personal information is volunteered? Although, and we're going under be wary of pitfalls at the bottom of 143, although you may successfully get through an interview without either directly or indirectly requesting personal information, you may nevertheless be in a receipt of personal information the applicant has revealed voluntarily. Should this occur, keep in mind that even though the applicant divulged this information voluntarily, you remain legally prohibited from using such personal information in making employment decisions. This is important to remember in part because some applicants will deliberately impart personal information in an effort to build sympathy, thinking that maybe you feel sorry for them, so you're going to automatically hire them. For example, many interviewers have heard appeals such as, "I've been unemployed for months and I'm the sole caretaker for an elderly parent," or "I'm a single parent with 2 children and I desperately need employment." Also, an occasional devious applicant may sometimes deliberately reveal membership in a class protected under civil rights law so as to later be able to complain, "I wasn't hired because of discrimination." All right, so we talked about the bona fide occupational qualifications. We talked about a couple of those. Again, the driver's license if the job requires driving. You can ask about convictions if the job involves security or safeguarding of people or assets. And then here's a third. You can ask if one has a specific degree, if the job legitimately requires it. All right, so at the beginning, for your consideration, we had those 25 questions. So the answers to those questions start on page 143, whether those questions were lawful or unlawful. So again, study those questions. Actually, they start on page 144, sorry. But the questions to ask about candidates start on 143. So the questions you are permitted to ask are broad and in many instances open-ended, and that's a good thing. You need to keep it that way. If you ask a person a yes or no question, you're not learning anything about the possible employee. So open-ended means they actually have to give you more than a yes or no, or a specific answer. So you're really wanting to make conversation. Ask them their career goals. Ask them, who have been your prior employers and why did you leave those previous positions? What was it that you liked or disliked about your previous job? What are your strong points? What are your weaknesses? Have the applicant actually talk through those things. Okay, so again, turning over to page 144, at the bottom of that section, if Human Resources has not already done so, ask the applicant to explain any gaps in employment of more than a few weeks' duration that appear on the resume or application. Some applicants will omit mention of unsuccessful job experiences or other involvements that they believe might negatively affect their chances of being hired. As the hiring supervisor, you should be in a position to make a fully informed decision based on more than just selected pieces of candidates' background. Also, you share a responsibility for ensuring that the organization is protected from possible negligent hiring charges should an employee who is hired without reasonable background verification cause harm. Okay, so again, here's our potential interview questions revisited. Gives you the answers of whether these were lawful or unlawful. I'm going to go ahead and tell you, you will probably have to match these on a test, whether or not the questions are lawful or unlawful. So you need to be familiar with these. And also what you need to be familiar with is if the question is stated one way, how could it be restated to become lawful? So you may have some of that on your test as well. So talking about employee references, we're going over to 145. The topic of employment references represents a quagmire of potential legal traps for both the supervisor and the Human Resources Department. Ideally, Human Resources should have secured the applicant's signed permission to check references as part of the screening interview, calling for a specific signed release for each former employer. For good reasons, many applicants indicate that their present employers not be approached for reference information, but they ordinarily grant permission to check with most, but not always with all, previous employers. No reference checks should be performed by anyone in the absence of an applicant's signed authorization to do so. And even if a signed release is presented, reference checking should be left to the HR department. Under no circumstances should an interviewing supervisor endeavor to check an applicant's references personally. Now, we're going to move over to page 146, and we're going to talk about the actual interview itself. So assume you've reached the point where you are well aware of questions you should avoid and well advised of the kinds of questions you should ask. In addition, assume that you and the applicant are now face-to-face in private and that you are mindful of the edge you hold in this interchange and of the possibly uncomfortable position of the applicant. Having reached this stage, proceed according to the following guidelines. So number 1, put the applicant at ease. At the beginning of the conversation, put them at ease. Instill a degree of confidence. Ask them what's the weather doing outside. Ask them if they're interested in a cup of coffee. Did they make it to your office okay? Number 2, kind of hit on this before. Avoid short answer questions. Avoid asking questions in such a way that they can be answered in 1 or 2 words, and especially avoid questions that can be answered simply yes or no. For instance, a question such as, how long did you work for County General Hospital? Could be simply answered as 3 years. So instead, say, please tell me about the work you did at County General Hospital. This is going to require them to use more than just a couple of words in response. Number 3, avoid leading or loaded questions. Avoid questions that lead the applicant towards some predetermined response. For instance, if you ask, you left County General because the pay raises weren't coming along, is that right? You are channeling the applicant toward a response that you may have already decided is correct. It's far better to ask, why did you leave County General? Number 4, ask one question at a time. This is important because sometimes interview questions can get lengthy in and of themselves, so you don't ever need to throw more than one question at an applicant at a time. So avoid going at the applicant with something like, what kind of work did you do there and why did you leave? Well, that's 2 questions. Ask what kind of work they did there. Let them answer that question, then move on and ask why they left. Number 5, take minimal notes, so keep your writing to a minimum. Try not to take a whole bunch of notes while they're talking. This can be disconcerting to them, making them think that you're writing down everything that's being said. And in some cases, that is what I personally would do during interviews, especially panel interviews. I would be the one that would record all the responses while everyone else made very minimal notes, listened, and asked questions. Number 6, use appropriate language. At all times, deliver your questions and comments in a language appropriate to the apparent level of education, knowledge, and understanding of the prospective employee. If you're a nursing supervisor interviewing an experienced registered nurse, you'll likely talk on a level at which you would ordinarily expect to communicate with a registered nurse. However, if you happen to be interviewing for the position of unit clerk, talking with a person who has never worked in a hospital, you should alter your language accordingly. Number 7, do more listening than talking. Throughout the interview, be interested and attentive, never impatient or critical. Avoid talking too much about yourself or the institution. And remember, you're not selling yourself to the applicant. The applicant is selling themselves to you. Number 8, promise follow-up. Indicate some type of follow-up. You may not always be able to get to them the next day, but you can always say something like, we'll let you know our decision after we finished all scheduled interviews, say within a week to 10 days. Or you should be getting a letter from us next week, or simply, we'll call you by Friday. In any case, conclude the interview with some simple indication of impending follow-up. Never let the applicant go away feeling that he or she has just been told, don't call us, we'll call you if we want you. And then part of your follow-up is, it's easy to give the follow-up when you're wanting to hire the applicant. You're calling them to offer them a position. But in either case, whether you're offering them the job or telling them they didn't get the job, you want to make sure the interview process has been taken full circle. So in circumstances when you don't wish to extend a job offer, you should still follow up and complete the interview cycle. Appropriate follow-up takes very little time, and once you've decided you do not wish to extend an offer, a short, polite letter is often appropriate as well. So that covers Chapter 8. Again, I hit the highlights, so it's going to be up to you to actually read the chapter and be comfortable with the subject matter. Thank you. Have a great day.